Good afternoon and a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. My name is Patricia Maria Weinman and I'm Associate Coordinator of Radius at MIT. If you'd like more information about Radius and our work, please go to radius.mit.edu. It is my pleasure to introduce Subrata Gashroy, a colleague and a good friend of Radius. Subrata will introduce our speaker today, Heidi Peltier, and act as moderator for today's program. Subrata is a research affiliate at MIT's program in Science, Technology, and Society. He is also a specially appointed professor at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. Earlier, he was, for many years, a senior engineer in the field of high-energy lasers. He was also a professional staff member at the House National Security Committee and later a senior analyst with the Government Accountability Office. Recently, Subrata published a white paper in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists that examines American congressional bipartisan support of missile defense. I will put a link to that paper in the chat. We will leave time for questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A function. Subrata and Heidi, many thanks for being here today.
Trish, thank you so much for organizing this event and for inviting Heidi, who I will introduce in a minute. This is such an important topic, and it is a pity that we have such low degree of public engagement. It's similar to nuclear weapons debate, that public just doesn't engage, and it is, yet we are in the middle of this pandemic with the economy the way it is, and so let me just say a couple of words, and you can find so much information on Radius website, other websites regarding the military spending. So in 2019, the U.S. allocation for the Pentagon was $732 billion, and that is more than the next 10 top spenders on military. So 732 billion versus 726 for the next 10 countries. And then if you look at the rest of the world, most of the country, 139 countries, and their combined spending is 460. So now we are in 2021, President Biden has just submitted the 2022 budget, which will officially go into effect in October of this year. So it's a 22, we are just about beginning to spend the 2021 dollars. We have been spending since last October, of course. But anyway, so the 2022 budget from President Biden, who is talking about taking bold steps to change the direction of the country, is $753 billion. So not only that there was no change from the Trump budget, that it's another hike on top of the incredible amounts of money that we're spending for on our the pandemic relief and infrastructure. So to talk about all of that and their impacts is Dr. Heidi Peltier, my friend, and Heidi participated in our seminar series last year, and is now quite well known in these circles in the Boston area and nationally also. She's the director of the 20 Years of War Project at Boston University, and is a research fellow at the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. Heidi previously was at the University of Massachusetts in the as a fellow in Political Economy Research Institute, Perry, in Amherst, Massachusetts. And Heidi's research includes analysis of the employment impacts of public and private sector investments, and particularly those that support the transition to a low carbon economy, the so-called Green New Deal. So it's a very, very important topic, and Heidi is really at the cutting edge of this work. So we are so happy to have Heidi Peltier with us today. With that, I turn over to Heidi.
Thank you so much, Subrata, for the introduction and for moderating today as well. And thank you, Trish, for inviting me and for setting up this webinar, and for all of you who are here today listening and chatting in the Q&A afterwards. So I'm going to put up a presentation here. Okay. So the title of the talk is Wait, What? How Much? U.S. military spending and national priorities. And so I'll talk some about U.S. military spending, the size of the U.S. military spending budget with regard to the rest of the world, and in relation to what else we spend money on in the federal budget, and some alternatives that we could have been funding or could be funding in the future. So as Subrata mentioned in the introduction, the U.S. spends more than the next 10 greatest spenders combined. So in 2019, this is data from SIPRI. They show the US defense budget at $732 billion. The next 10 countries combined, $726 billion. So the US spends currently 10 times as much as Russia, 10 times as much as India, and about 3 times as much as China. Looking at budget authority by function. So this is the way that the budget is categorized by the function, so not necessarily the department, but so the defense function includes both the Department of Defense as well as defense-related activities in the Department of Energy, so the atomic activities in the DOE, and other defense-related activities in other departments, like in the FBI, for example. And so there's one line I've left off that would be above defense, and that's Social Security. But if you look here, defense spending has gone from about 300 billion. These are in thousands. So these are in millions. So 300 billion in 2000 up to about 750 billion in 2020, with obviously a peak in 2008 to 2011 when troops were surging in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can see that some of these other, I hope you can see my mouse pointing here, some of these other little spikes in other programs. This was in 2009, this was stimulus spending. So we spend more on defense than the next couple things are Medicaid and Medicare, both health-related spending, and then interest costs. And I'll mention those because the cost of war is exacerbating the public debt and increasing how much we are spending on interest to pay for those wars. If you look at just discretionary spending, so this is the spending that that Congress makes decisions on every year, as opposed to mandatory spending, which is set through laws and formulas for how the spending is distributed. So the discretionary funding that Congress makes decisions about every year, the Department of Defense gets 51% of that spending. If you add Homeland Security and the Department of Veterans Affairs, we get to about 2/3 of discretionary spending going to military-related sources. And for comparison, the EPA, you can see at the top of the pie chart, the EPA gets 1% of discretionary spending, the National Science Foundation 1%. And we can talk not just about the defense budget or the DoD budget, which is part of the defense budget, but the militarized budget, which includes the DoD spending plus activities, atomic activities in the Department of Energy, and other defense-related activities, plus veterans benefits and services, plus Homeland Security spending, plus intelligence across various agencies, plus the cost of public debt attributable to military spending. And if we put all of that together, the militarized budget is well over $1 trillion. And the estimate by the Project on Government Oversight, POGO, puts it at about 1.25 trillion. So two of the reasons, and these are not exclusive, but two of the reasons for excessive military spending are how much we spend on the post and have spent and continue to spend on the post 9/11 wars, and how much we spend on military contracting. So the cumulative total spending for the post 9/11 wars, the most recent estimate by Nita Crawford of the Cost of War Project, and she's also chair of the political science department at BU. Her most recent estimate came out in November 2019, and that was for $5.4 trillion of war spending so far, and another $1 trillion of obligations for post 9/11 veterans. So 6.4 trillion total. Now, those costs have gone up since November 19, and she'll be coming up with a new estimate that will come out this summer. We expect that to be over 7 trillion by now. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And then another reason for excessive military spending is how much we spend on military contracting. So as of the past few years, we now spend half of the discretionary defense budget, actually half of the defense budget goes to military contractors. In 2019, fiscal year 2019, that was $370 billion. Fiscal year 2020 was about 390 billion. And I have a paper on military contracting that came out last June called The Growth of the Camo Economy and the Commercialization of the Post 9/11 Wars. And that goes into a lot of the reasons that we spend so much on military contracting and why military contracting turns out to be much more expensive than expected, and turns out to be an added expense rather than a way to save funds. And I'll go into some of those reasons in a minute. Let's see here. Okay, so to look first at war-related spending. So this is table 1 out of Nita Crawford's paper that came out in 2019. So the top line is OCO spending, so overseas contingency operations. This used to be called the Global War on Terror. Now it's called OCO. So about $2 trillion through the Department of Defense, and a little bit more in OCO spending through the State Department and USAID. Then we have estimated interest on borrowing. I worked on a paper on this, looking at how much we have borrowed for the wars, because essentially all of the post 9/11 wars have been financed through debt, as opposed to raising taxes or selling war bonds or doing other things to finance war like we've historically done. Pretty much all of this OCO funding that we see here is funded through debt. And so the interest on that debt, which has been growing since 2001, comes out to about 925 billion. Actually, if we bring it up to the present day, it's closer to $1 trillion. But when this paper was written, it was 925 billion just on interest on the debt. Then we have additions to the DoD base budget. So not including the entire base budget, the kind of regular operating budget for the Pentagon, but the increases over their regular operating budget that are attributable to the wars. Then there's a new category of funding, which is essentially a kind of funding gimmick that allowed military spending to increase even while there were budget caps in place. So there's this new category called OCO for base. And then medical and disability care for post 9/11 veterans, the cost of homeland security spending over $1 trillion. That all gets us to $5.4 trillion spent on the war. And then over $1 trillion that we'll be spending for our obligations for veterans, medical and disability over the next 40 years or so. This is just a table that's in a paper that I wrote in, it was published in January 2020 through the Cost of War Project, called the Cost of Debt Financed War. And it addresses this issue of how are we paying for war and what's the added expense of funding war through debt. And the U.S. public debt, has been high for some time now, but and has gotten higher still during COVID, with stimulus payments and other types of relief through COVID. And so now I think the public debt is something like 27 or 28 trillion dollars, excuse me. And the Congressional Budget Office before COVID happened, before the onset of COVID, the Congressional Budget Office had estimated that by 2030, something like 10 or 11% of all federal spending would just be paying interest on the debt. Now that'll be even a greater percentage of federal spending given the increases in public debt during the COVID era. So to come back to the topic of military contracting. So the idea behind military contracting, certainly as it was sold to the American public, was that privatizing parts of government would decrease the cost of producing certain goods and services, because competition would create cost reducing pressures, and the result would be higher quality, lower cost goods and services. But it turns out that Department of Defense contracting in particular, for the most part, does not have these competitive advantages that reduce costs. And part of that is just the nature of the contracts themselves. So contracts in the federal government can either be cost type contracts or fixed price contracts. So a fixed price contract, the contractor and the government work out what will be delivered, what will be the final cost, and if there's any kind of cost overrun, the contractor bears that cost. With a cost type contract, it's a more open-ended type of contract. So the contractor is reimbursed for all reasonable costs plus some level of profit, so a percentage or a level of profit in addition to the cost. And because they're reimbursed for all of their costs, there's no cost reducing pressure for the contractor. The government and the taxpayer ultimately is responsible for all the cost overruns. And so the DoD contracts over the past decade or so, a little more than a decade, 30% of those contracts were cost type contracts as opposed to fixed price. So that's 30%, that's over $1 trillion of contracts were not subject to these kinds of competitive pressures because they were contracts in which all costs would be reimbursed. And then in addition to that, you have a different category of, or a different way of categorizing contracts, which they can be either competitive contracts or non-competitive contracts. And the DoD is very different from other departments in the federal government in that many more of their contracts are non-competitive contracts. It was, as of last year, or as of 2019, 45% of DoD contracts were non-competitive. So contracts can be non-competitive either because there's some matter of national security or urgency, or only one supplier can be identified. And so there are, and those can all be legitimate reasons, or they can be used as reasons. But in any case, 45% are non-competitive. So again, these contracts essentially are monopoly creating contracts. So rather than replacing government monopoly with a competitive private market, essentially what you're doing is replacing government monopoly with commercial monopoly. And so you're not getting any of the cost savings that are promised. And in fact, the cost ends up being higher because you have monopoly production, commercial instead of governmental, and then you have a layer of profits on top of that. So the cost ends up being even higher. Then there are other kinds of contracting mechanisms like lifetime contracts or sole supplier contracts. So for example, Lockheed Martin has a lifetime contract to repair and maintain the F-35. So no other contractor can compete for that. So that's another type of monopoly. And then finally, de facto monopolies. So these are conditions where, let's say, a contractor goes to Iraq or Afghanistan and builds infrastructure and runs dining facilities and so on. And their contract could be recompeted each year, but in reality, other companies aren't often vying for those contracts because there's a working relationship between the contractor and the military officers who are serving there, and the costs of getting out and getting a new contractor in are so high that there's sort of this de facto monopoly that's created. And then in addition, you have waste, fraud, abuse, excessive profits, and various other reasons why contracting can be so expensive. So the Afghanistan papers that were published in the Washington Post at the end of 2019 had plenty of examples where there's a lack of oversight, too many dollars flowing out too quickly, especially at the beginning of the wars and during the troop surges, where there was just not a good sense of where those dollars were flowing. And sometimes they were actually flowing into the hands of insurgents that we were there trying to fight. And then examples of overbilling, billing for services never performed. So there was a lawsuit against KBR that found that they were billing for 136 meals for every 100 that they served. All kinds of bribes and corruption. DoD officers who are controlling contracts, getting kickbacks in order to give out contracts to certain contractors, and then you have profit coming in as another reason that it's so expensive, and sort of corrupting influence as well. So you see this especially in the amount of political lobbying, where military contracting is incredibly lucrative, and it makes sense for firms like Lockheed that are earning anywhere from $4 to $8 billion in profits over the last few years, mostly through government contracts. It makes sense that they would spend somewhere in the ballpark of like $13 million a year on lobbying. So 13 million in lobbying is a very small expense compared to the 4 to 8 billion that they're earning through government contracts. And then also you have this interaction between the layers of contracting and layers of profit. So where a subcontractor, and this is an interaction, especially with the cost type contracts. So you have a contractor subcontracting and further subcontracting. So for example, a contractor that's providing dining services contracts with a vendor who can provide certain foods, who contracts with another vendor, another subcontractor who provides some of those foods, and each of those contractors can be reimbursed for their costs plus profit. So you have levels of profit at each stage of the contract and subcontract. And so this has certain budgetary implications. So if we have this excessive military spending, and we're not going to cut military spending, and we heard from Subrata that the fiscal 22 budget is going to continue to go up from where it is now, up to over 753 billion, I think it is. If we're not cutting military spending, this puts pressure on other public spending, either to cut non-military spending, or if non-military spending is going to continue to rise as well or not be cut, this increases the public debt, which then leads to greater interest payments and reduces future opportunities for either defense or non-defense spending. So over the past 20 years, we've already spent $3 trillion just on the post 9/11 wars. That's just OCO plus interest. And so the question is, what else could we have done with those funds? Or we could look at the total cost of the wars, 5.4 trillion already spent, or 6.4 trillion when we include future obligations. So there's a question for us of, is this how we want to be using public resources? These are our tax dollars at work. We have a militarized budget of over $1 trillion. We spend over half of the discretionary budget on DoD, about 2/3 of it if we include other defense related or military related departments and offices. And this brings to mind a book by Rosa Brooks, who is a Georgetown law professor and worked in the DoD. She wrote a book called How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything. And one of the phenomena that she describes in that book is how DoD started taking over more of the types of work that other agencies like the Department of State and USAID had been doing. So some reconstruction work and agricultural support and well drilling and all of those types of things. As the DoD took on more of those roles, the State Department and USAID had less justification for receiving same levels of funding that they had been receiving. And so then as their funding got cut and needs arose, the DoD was more able to handle those new needs. So more, well drilling and agriculture and reconstruction and so on. And so the military sort of gains in strength. There's this cumulative effect, and these other departments, which are, part of the diplomatic solution or other ways to handle foreign policy, these get funding cuts while DoD gets funding increases. And I'm short on time, so I'm going to skip over these, the parable of the wolves or the Matthew principle, but I can talk about those if anybody knows those or wants to know how they're relevant or anything like that. So to look at some alternative opportunities, the American Society of Civil Engineers puts out a report card on America's infrastructure. And they have found that to bring American infrastructure up to a B score in all categories of infrastructure would require a $2.6 trillion investment over 10 years. So that's about $260 billion per year. And I'm sorry, I'm noticing the transcript. I hope that I wasn't having volume problems. I apologize if that was, and if this headset isn't working well. Okay, so the infrastructure gap would cost us about $260 billion per year in investments over 10 years to get the U.S. economy, the U.S. infrastructure back up to a level that would get us basically a B in all categories. Another alternative opportunity is in healthcare. So as of 2019, according to the Congressional Budget Office, about 30 million people, 12% of the population under age 65, were still without healthcare coverage. And an article that came out in the Lancet last year found that reaching universal coverage would cost about $149 billion per year above current levels. Next, to talk about education, and I'll go quickly through this. A program to provide nationwide early childhood education would cost about $40 billion per year and ultimately would pay for itself through productivity and other means, or an alternative plan to subsidize childcare or education for all children under 5 who are in families earning up to 200% of the federal poverty level. So 42 billion a year for early childhood education. And then climate change. So in 2014, I was working at the Political Economy Research Institute and was part of a group that put out a study called Green Growth, a US program for controlling climate change and expanding job opportunities. And in that study, we show that to lower emissions by 40% over the next 20 years, which is what the IPCC was recommending, the US would need to invest $200 billion annually. And another study that came out more recently by Mark Jacobson and others found that the energy portions of the Green New Deal, which include a full transition to renewable energy by 2050, would cost about $7.8 trillion upfront, which is about $260 billion per year over 30 years, but then would save about $3.1 trillion per year in climate damages. So these are a few estimates ranging from $40 billion a year for early childhood education up to about $260 billion a year for climate change or infrastructure upgrades. And when we think about what this means for jobs, a lot of times military spending is upheld as a way to create or maintain jobs in the economy, and that we can't cut military spending because then we would lose jobs. But what we find, and I've worked on a number of studies looking at this question, what we find is that military spending, while it does create jobs, doesn't create as many as some other alternative industries. So clean energy and infrastructure create about 40% more jobs than the military for the same amount of spending. Healthcare creates twice as many jobs, and education even more than twice as many. So shifting funding from the military into these other areas would create jobs. This comes from a paper a couple years ago, so the total spending would be a little different, but at that time we were spending about $260 billion a year on the post 9/11 wars, or our total spending averaged out to $260 billion a year. With that, we created about 1.8 million jobs through defense and throughout the supply chain. But if you look at clean energy or education or infrastructure or healthcare, these all create many more jobs. If you average them, it came out to about 3.2 million jobs instead of 1.8 million in defense. So if you look at the chart on the right, the level blue bar is what we created through defense spending, and the sort of white and black slashed lines above are the jobs we would have created that we didn't, but we could have. These are the opportunity cost if we had spent it in those sectors instead. So I'll talk just a little bit about demilitarizing and transitioning, because one of the issues is that we do in the aggregate create more jobs with a shift from military to other sectors, but losses will occur for some individuals and for some communities. There are certain communities that are very dependent upon certain military bases for their economy, and people who are, lifetime military careers. And so to think about just shifting from military or some of the military spending into other areas, there will be some losses. And so we have to think about what this means for transitioning. And one way to think about this is what's called a just transition. So I worked on this with the green economy and transitioning fossil fuel workers and fossil fuel dependent communities into the green economy. And so there are various things to think about, both for the individual level and the community level. So for the individual, it requires retraining and relocation assistance in some cases. Also wage guarantees. Fossil fuel wages in many cases are higher than clean energy wages, or at least for some workers within the fossil fuel economy. So when we looked at that just transition, we included wage guarantees for the first few years in which workers are transitioning from higher paid to lower paid work. And the same might be true as we think about transitioning from the military economy into a green economy. And then also community level support, including grants and targeted investments. So one example is if there's a community that's dependent on a military base, making sure that green investments are made in that community, creating new jobs in the areas where the job losses would be greatest. There are opportunities and challenges here, and there is a lot of crossover. So if you look at the military occupational codes and where military jobs, what types of occupations they consist of, 22% of military personnel work in mechanical and repair positions, 16% in engineering, science, and technical positions, 14% in transportation and material handling, 6% in executive and administrative and managerial positions. So that's nearly half of military jobs. And these are all jobs, occupations that are needed in the green economy and that are needed in infrastructure design and construction. And those are two of the areas that I showed earlier have the greatest need and opportunity for investment. There are difficulties because of wage premiums and contracting in particular. So these highly profitable contractors like Lockheed and Raytheon, Northrop Grumman can offer much higher wages than the average for engineers or technicians or other occupations throughout the economy. So there will be this issue to deal with of moving people from higher wage to lower wage jobs, or creating a competing source of demand. So creating more demand from the federal government, for example, for procurement of green technologies, and creating a green economy that has competitive wages, where there is an attraction for workers who are looking whether to move into the military economy or the green economy. So I think I will end there, and I look forward to your questions and comments. And again, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for this excellent presentation. And there is just so much information you have provided. I mean, even I've been thinking about this for so long, but I wasn't familiar with a lot of the detailed work that you have been doing and others with you regarding this critical business of the transition to a green economy, and how jobs will be created, what type of jobs, and how engineers, scientists, etc., in the defense sector. And you correctly point out that this premium wages that this highly profitable contractors like Lockheed, Raytheon, and others pay is a big challenge in terms of matching these kinds of salaries, etc. So yeah, it's fantastic talk, and I'm very glad that you're here. And I noticed there was a lot of traffic on the chat, so Trish will take over and see what kind of questions people have that we can discuss.
Most of the questions had to deal with accessing your slides afterwards, Heidi, and also when we post the program on our website, we'll archive that, and other links that people are interested in. So Heidi, maybe you and I can chat about that after the program and make sure we get those resources on our website.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy to share the slide presentation, and everything that was in the presentation has links to the source documents. But we can also put links. I think Trish might have put a link to the cost of war site that would have all the papers that I've written and mentioned today. And those are linked to in the PowerPoint presentation, which I'm happy to share.
So Heidi, so is there any specific question, Trish, on the chat that anybody asked? Or
not right now, but
okay.
Tim Weiskell is suggesting, and hi Tim, there's a lot we could build upon here. Historical material is important, and I should, that's a great idea. I can put that in on our website, that the Eisenhower farewell address is quite compelling, and we can put that as well.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I mean, this was 1961. This is 2021, 60 years ago that Eisenhower made that speech, and he just gave very similar arguments about how many schools we can build for one missile and things of that sort. So those comparisons have been around for a long time, and now, of course, they are more detailed in terms of, because we are hoping to transition into a different kind of economy, but regardless, the underlying points are the same. Heidi, I have one question, and that is in this new, I haven't followed it in detail, the new legislation that Ed Markey and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have introduced in the House and the Senate. Are there anything legislative-wise regarding this development of transition plans and so forth, and how do we really implement it? Because one thing I was thinking, I mean, Pentagon should be required to create a transition plan for Congress.
You know, I have not looked at the Markey AOC plan, so I don't know what it includes. But certainly there should be. There are various things that the DoD could be doing to think about transition, both in terms of their own transition to cleaner energy, which is something that they are thinking about, partly from a security perspective. But you know, also other groups need to be working with the DoD to think about ways to transition away from some of the kind of wasteful areas in which production continues to happen. And there are cases even where the DoD is getting funds that they don't want, because there are congressmen who want to fund something in their district, and the DoD says, we don't need this.
Yes.
So thinking about ways to work with DoD to cut some of that waste and transition those funds into better uses.
Yeah, this is just an aside about that despite the fact that the defense budget they say that this 753 million, a billion, which includes the Department of Energy and maybe some Department of Homeland Security, because the base budget or core budget for the 2022 that President Biden has submitted is like 715 billion, but the total is 753 when you include those things. And you will see, even under the present circumstances, that that number is only going to go up a little bit, because Trump asked for 730 or something, 732, and it went up to 741. So there was this 9 billion that was introduced by the Senate and the House in the last year's 2021 budget. And 22, this is going to also go up. And so there is really room, since nobody's going to cut the Pentagon budget under the present circumstances, it can only go up. And they're saying it's a 1.5% adjustment for inflation. But nobody's talking about the tremendous amount of underfunding of these other programs, like you point out, from education to healthcare and others. It's only when it comes to the Pentagon, when we talk about equity and a balanced approach so that the national security is not hurt. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, that's right. And the Pentagon budget has gone up on average about 5% a year, regardless of whether we're at war or not at war. And so, as you point out exactly correctly, that the Pentagon budget only goes up. That we see in that one of the first slides I presented with the line graph. You see fluctuations in how rapidly it's rising. But what we see is sometimes there's a slowdown in the rise, but it's still a rise. So it just continues to go up pretty much regardless of whether we're in war or peace. And when you have half of the budget going to contractors that have an incentive to keep earning their profits and keep gaining new contracts from defense, there are pushes to modernize weapon systems to create new opportunities for contractors. There are pushes to stay at war to create opportunities for those contractors that are servicing. Now I just looked at the contractor numbers in Afghanistan, because we're supposedly withdrawing from Afghanistan later this year. Right now, contractors outnumber troops 4-1, at least 4-1 in Afghanistan. And I actually just wrote an op-ed on this that came out in the Boston Globe yesterday. It'll come out in the print edition on Sunday. What does it mean to withdraw from Afghanistan in terms of the numbers of people we have there? It's unlikely that all the troops and all the contractors will come home. Some of those will just be moved outside of Afghanistan, but nearby. But we often don't talk about the magnitude of the contractors who are there doing all kinds of services. And there's a real incentive to continue staying at war when you have profits to earn, when it's not just the Department of Defense using taxpayer dollars, but it's a private entity earning profits by staying there.
Well, congratulations on the op-ed. We look forward to seeing it, Heidi. And this point on the Afghanistan pullout. So we were spending, the numbers better, how many billions per year in Afghanistan. So a simple question is, where is that money going to go? Because if the defense top line is not decreasing, that supposed saving from pulling out of Afghanistan is finding someplace in the Pentagon budget.
Yeah, and I don't have good answers to that, but what we hear mostly about is defending ourselves against the threats from Russia and China, and so there are increases in cybersecurity, which is global, but including from those two countries, and talk about increasing the U.S. presence in the Pacific, and so it's there's very little talk about shrinking the Pentagon budget. It's just a question of moving it, as you mentioned, to other parts of the Pentagon budget. And part of the issue is that there's bipartisan support for increased defense spending. There is a group of people on Capitol Hill who do want to decrease spending, and there's it's called the Defense Spending Reduction Caucus. And they tried to pass a 10% cut in defense spending last summer in the National Defense Authorization Act. They were unsuccessful, but there is this core group of people that needs to grow and needs to become more powerful in order to get some of these budget cuts passed. But on both the Republican and Democratic side, there is support for increased spending. And I think we use, or some use the idea, the threat of security, of feeling insecure to bolster this defense budget, when really we need to be thinking of all kinds of different security issues. So climate change is actually the biggest threat to our national security, and then there are all other kinds of security, like income security. And we saw during COVID, you know, the number of people who lost their jobs or who you know, faced all kinds of consequences. So there's economic security and climate security and all kinds of security that are part of and should be discussed as part of our national security, that it's not just guns and tanks and drones, but it's also income support and measures to reduce carbon emissions, and also to improve our infrastructure to withstand these, you know, the higher winds and the storms and all the things that we're starting to see as consequences of climate change.
Absolutely right. Trish, is there anything somebody wants to ask specifically, or are we?
No questions at this time. The request for again, those resources, which we will post on the Radius website, and some great suggestions for other links and resources. So I will post all of those. Yeah.
I would just mention, Heidi, another thing that's about the Pentagon budget is not only is this incredibly large black hole, the budget, that it really is, it doesn't have, or it does have very little transparency. It is one of the agencies within the US government that is not auditable. They do not produce a properly auditable financial statement or report. This is so trillions, at least hundreds of billions, if not trillions, are hidden away that nobody knows where the money is. And on top of it, we're adding every year to the money.
That's exactly right. And the DoD failed its most recent audit, which I think was 2 years ago. I can't remember exactly when it was, but it failed its most recent audit. You know, there are all kinds of issues in terms of public access to information, all kinds of things where, you know, things are classified. And also there's been a decrease in transparency. So for example, if we're looking at where our troops are stationed around the world, the DoD produces a quarterly report of troop levels in different countries. And the troops we have in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, those numbers stopped being reported as of December 2017. So up until September 2017, they had been reported along with all other countries. And in the past 3 years, 3+ years, we no longer know the troop levels in those 3 countries. And then you have, you know, classified information that isn't revealed. You have just difficulties or a lack of capability of managing their own finances at DoD. And then you have this issue of half of their budget goes to private firms. And then once those funds are in the hands of private firms, very little needs to be made publicly available. So we don't know a lot about the workforce of the what I call the camo economy, the military contracting economy. And I call it the camo economy partly because of this issue. We don't know where the funds go. We don't know exactly who's working on what. It also, you know, it camouflages how many people are involved in the wars and how many people are involved in the military economy. It allows presidents to say we're reducing troop levels when we could actually be increasing our presence in country by increasing the contractors. So there are all kinds of transparency issues, both around budget and around people.
Yeah, that's just amazing. I was also noticing that in the Biden budget, noticing in the sense that I read a little press clip on this issue of biological weapons related work. So we have serious allegations that the virus could have leaked out of a very, very high security BSL-4 lab, which Boston University has one. But so the BSL-4 labs are all over the United States and around the world as well. And these people are utilizing a loophole in the Biological Weapons Convention that Professor John King worked on so much in the 80s and 90s in banning biological weapons research. And they created this loophole after 9/11 that you can do biological weapons research defense because we are being threatened by this. And Biden budget is actually increasing. But my question is, these labs, which were created supposedly to find cures to vaccines for the forward-looking viruses that will attack us, where is the vaccine coming out of this biological weapons research? What are we doing? Spending billions on this thing. And nobody's raising these questions. And I'm sure that the Democrats will pretty much sign off on this kind of increases on biological weapons research as well.
So Subrata, that might be a bigger question that we could ask today, but we do have a couple questions that have come in.
Okay.
Heidi, someone's asking, why did the war bonds lose favor after World War II? I mean, it certainly made the expense of war more transparent, or is that the answer?
Yeah, I think you're right. That is the answer. It's easier, more. There is less objection to war when people don't realize how much we're spending on it. Fewer families have someone in their family going to fight in war than used to be the case. And when we're not directly paying, we don't notice. We are paying. Every single one of us is paying for these wars, but we don't notice. I have no idea. So it's one of the ways that we can go to war and remain at war without any political opposition. I think people would be much more vocal about ending the wars and ending the wars a lot sooner if they felt how much they were paying for it.
Yeah. Layla is asking, who are the Mass senators and representatives? What are their positions on military spending, besides perhaps Markey? And who are the members who support the budget defense reductions?
I can find that out because I do have, there is a public list available for who voted for and against these, by state and by congressional district. So I can provide that afterwards. Maybe I'll send the link to Trish if you can share it with people who are interested.
Absolutely.
I don't know offhand who in Massachusetts. But
I was also asking a follow-up. Is there any hope to lobby the White House and Congress to reduce this budget? As citizens, what should we be doing?
I think the most hopeful thing I'm seeing now is an intersection in activism around reducing defense spending and increasing green spending and green programs. And I think the more we can make public the more we can raise public awareness of how much we're spending on defense and how much we could be shifting that spending into green, there's a real opportunity there. And I've spoken with some groups who are working on peace issues, but now moving into kind of intersecting with groups who are working on green issues or are taking on green issues themselves, where there's this real opportunity to use a cut in the defense budget to fund the parts of the Green New Deal.
And Tim is asking, what's being done at the Party Center? Do you work in separate, I don't like to call them silos, but is there integration and ways to communicate in ways that you just talked about?
It's something that we do discuss how we can integrate some of our programs. So I work in the cost of war program, and then there are some other programs that are more explicitly working on environmental issues, or there's the Rising Powers Initiative that looks at China, for example. And specifically in speaking with some of the fellows who are working on environmental issues, there's a real intersection with the environment and the military, not only in the sense that we can shift funds from the military to the environment, but also that climate change is a real security threat, that climate change will exacerbate the movement of people, it will exacerbate wars over resources, water, food, and other resources, and that thinking about the effect of the climate on human systems, which is one of the programs. We have a program at Pardee called the CHANS program, that coupled human and natural systems. And so thinking about how natural and human systems are affected by the climate and what that means for security issues, there is some overlap there. So it's something we're thinking about.
And finally, there's a couple comments and questions about the military draft. If people, if our children were sent to war in a draft, would that make us much more aware of what's
I am
going on?
certain that it would. Now, I'm not going to make any comments for or against the draft, but I am certain that if people thought that their brothers and sisters and sons and daughters or parents could get drafted, that they would think a lot more about opposing wars that right now we don't even think about. Now there's some attention to Afghanistan because we're talking about pulling out 20 years later, but for how many of the past few years did people even realize that we're still in Afghanistan? I think they'd think a lot more about it and be more opposed to being at war if there was a chance that their own family members or themselves could be drafted, for sure.
I would imagine there's a very slim chance that a draft would ever be reinstated. Yeah,
I agree.
And we have time for one more question. Margaret's asking, is the military making significant investments in microgrids, electric vehicles, and other environmentally sound technologies?
They are making investments in increasing their energy efficiency and their use of renewable energy on bases in particular. But one of the things about the military, and Nita Crawford has done some work on this, if you're interested in looking at the emissions and the environmental impacts, is that most of the emissions created by the military are for fuel use, for mobile things, for jet fuel in particular. That's the main source of fuel use and main source of emissions. And right now there isn't really an alternative for jet fuel. And so the best way the military can reduce its fuel use and reduce its emissions is to have fewer operations around the world. But the military does recognize that climate change is an issue for itself, and also energy use is a budgetary issue for itself. So it is making investments in its own bases to try to green its own operations.
Okay, one more. We have time. We have 2 minutes. Could you please share your thoughts on how the ongoing US-China trade war might impact the size of the military budget, and how that budget would be allocated? How would it be justified?
I'm not sure I'd be able to answer the second part of that, but I will say that having friendly trading relations is good for not needing as much military power. So it is the case that nations that are trading partners tend not to be military opponents. So the more we think of China, the more that US thinks of China as an opponent, the more it's going to build up its own military in response to that.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. We are so grateful and so fortunate to have you with us today. And for all of you attending, thank you very much. Again, we will put all the resources that have come through and Heidi's slides and the recording of the program on our website. That should all be accomplished by later this afternoon or tomorrow.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.
Subrata, thank you as always. You're the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both. And thanks everyone who was here.
Thank you,
Great to see you all.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.